Greetings, friends and educators. We are Anne and Lauren, and this is the Informed Educator. Today's guest is Shaghig Chaparian, who is a Ph.D. candidate at New York University, specializing in science and environmental education. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Biology with a minor in education and earned her MA in Science Education from the American University in Beirut. She also completed the International Program on Intercultural Competence at the University of Zurich. Shaghig has extensive experience as a university instructor and has taught science at the middle school level in the United States and in the Middle East. In addition to her teaching background, she has worked with various non-governmental organizations in roles such as educational researcher, consultant, team leader, and program developer. She has also conducted fieldwork with the Kayapo indigenous community in the Brazilian Amazon. Her research focuses on building cross-sector partnerships to enhance public, climate, and environmental literacy. She is particularly committed to fostering science education that supports informed and active citizenship and sustainable communities. Additionally, she works on capacity building for educators and other stakeholders by facilitating communities of practice. Welcome. To start off, could you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you came to academia?
Thank you so much, Lauren, for this opportunity. And the journey to academia was long, and it's still going on. It started with the big love for biology under the influence of one of my science teachers in high school. And I also, now thinking back, I was fortunate enough to spend my childhood a lot in nature. And I think that influenced a lot who I am today. And as I progressed in my studies and my personal experiences, I started to understand science and environment from different lenses, different social lenses. And I came to the realization that merely understanding science was not enough. And what mattered just as much was like how we teach science and whether it truly empowers people to understand their realities and recognize their role in the world. And that led me shift to my focus to science education during my master's degree. I'm currently in science education and environmental education program, and I focus on how to make communities more sustainable through education. But my passion of environmental education originates not just from academic curiosity, but also personal experiences. I grew up just a few hundred meters away from a landfill, and I spent most of my time in the same area. And I always complained about it and never deeply questioned its presence until one day we woke up to see that all the debris from the landfill were dumped into the sea, simply pushed into the sea. And that moment profoundly unsettled me and continues to unsettle me until the moment. And then I just began to ask, like, why did my community, including my own family, accept that situation? And why did I accept that situation? And I often think about how I could have done better for my community and understood that the landfill wasn't just an environmental issue. It represented the story of power, neglect, and how communities became desensitized of the realities that they were living in. So this questioning shaped my master's thesis, where I explored the nature of science as not merely an objective practice, but as something deeply intertwined with social, political, and ethical dimensions. And now my PhD dissertation continues that narrative, but with a sharper focus on how systems thinking can transform science and environmental education in general.
I'm already going to go a little bit off script here because I'm just so interested in what you're talking about. So we'll come to defining systems thinking and eco-pedagogy in just a moment. But in hearing you talk about this and how you started off in biology, I think a lot about, so I also work in science education, and I think a lot about the goals of different courses that we teach in the sciences, particularly in high school. So in Ontario, right, I'm not as familiar with American curriculum documents, but in Ontario specifically, right, we have biology, physics, and chemistry courses. We also have environmental science courses. But when we look at the goals of the science curriculum specifically, the goals aren't they're knowledge based, right? We want students to have a certain understanding of the world specific to the subject area. There's a bit of, career content, or we talk about STEM skills, engineering, design, and so on. But what you're talking about goes so much deeper than that. And I wonder just about your opinion on this. Do you think that educators have the responsibility of considering what perhaps the goals are of science and how these could be refocused to support more of a systems approach, or consider the social dimensions of the sciences? And what might you say to that in a time when the curriculum is very slow to change, but the need is ever greater for this kind of learning?
Mhm. I am happy you brought this up because these types of conversations of what is the real goal of science education came up a lot, especially during COVID, when we experienced COVID, and we kept asking ourselves, like, did science education fail in the COVID situation or not? Um, and here I want to, of course, teachers have a lot of agency in the process. Um, curriculums, curricula, and standards that are written on the paper, they can change with priorities of the um environmental and educational agencies change with time. But I want to focus here on the essence of the teachers, like something we call the blind spot of the teachers, which means like the intention and the attention of whatever they do, where do they come from? And as novice teachers, when we enter the field from the perspective and the blind spot that we want to change the world through the power of education. But that diminishes with time because of the organizational and institutional structures that treat teachers as laborers, but that doesn't align with teaching, the nature of teaching. So keeping that intention and kind of the politicized care the novice teachers enter the field is the core of deciding or guiding the dimensions and the goals of science education. And it plays a great role in that sense. And those intentions give us also the opportunity to rethink what are the goals of the curricula we're teaching. Am I teaching the content just for mere understanding of the subject, or really I'm here to empower these group of people beyond the school and community levels, and now that we're going to talk about like different system levels? I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, it's perfect.
So, in your experience, would you say that the essence and the original intention and philosophy of young or new teachers tends to be deeper and more profound and more connected than it is 5 years down the road? Do you believe that what we need is already present and is just being consumed for some reason by other energies? Or do you believe that we need to, in fact, actually develop what is required from like a place of deficit almost?
Yeah, I believe, and from my experience, when you just enter the field and you haven't still entered these technicalities and formalities of teaching, you don't understand those and you're not doing those perfectly yet. your intention and passion is there. But unfortunately, organization structures and the focus of the professional development programs that focus more on the skills and the technicalities rather than restoring and preserving that essence of teaching, that is where things start to diminish from my experience and my observations, and listening to others' experiences as well. It's just entering a rigid bureaucratic system,
Awesome. So when I first met you, I was a participant in a workshop that you were leading at a conference on environmental education. And the workshop you were leading, from what I can recall, really focused on eco-pedagogy and systems thinking. And so for those of us who might be new to these concepts, could you tell us what they are and how they connect?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for giving space to talk about these, as my passion is in these two. So eco-pedagogy is deeply influenced by the work of Paulo Freire, who was a renowned Brazilian educator, politician, and activist, and whose educational philosophies encourage students to move beyond passively consuming knowledge, but actively questioning, critiquing, and transforming the world around them. And eco-pedagogy is a similar approach of education, but focused on environmental and sustainability education that critically examines the relationship between humans and environment. And another way of saying like how environmental justice or violence is somehow associated with social and environmental violence. There is a big emphasis in eco-pedagogy on social justice and political and civic engagement and ethical responsibility. To give an example of what do we mean by these social and environmental justice interconnections, we preach the importance of shifting to solar energy, and we preach it as an essential solution to ecological problems and as a part of the development. But eco-pedagogy requires us to go beyond and analyze what are some social issues related to the problems or the solutions we are suggesting for ecological issues or sustainability in general. If we do so, we will be asking at the expense of what are we creating these solutions? What other problems are these solutions creating? In this example, we need cobalt to make the solar panels, and 70% of cobalt on the planet is found in Republic of Congo. So there is a new wave of exploitation and colonization happening for the sake of extracting new types of metal that we need for new purposes, which is under the name of sustainability. But this reality is creating a severe social and environmental justice issues in the Republic of Congo. So how do we actually navigate these complexities of sustainable solutions and, on the other side, social problems, is the core of eco-pedagogy. And if we study the goals of eco-pedagogy closely, we learn that there are so many types of literacies involved to reach to this level of criticality. And this approach, eco-pedagogy in general, is highly interdisciplinary and complex, which requires the development of not only environmental literacy, but political literacy, global economic literacy, civic literacy, media and information literacy, epistemic literacies. So, and when we commonly refer to critical pedagogies or critical thinking in general, we often do it in a very superficial way, like sometimes ignoring the complexities that involve like the true critical thinking. And I'm arguing here that critical thinking is based on several foundational skills, one of which is the systems thinking. So systems thinking becomes a tool for making the journey of developing this true like critical thinking or critical literacy accessible and tangible, more tangible. So when we say what is systems thinking, there are different ways of defining systems thinking depending on the context and the discipline we are talking about. Because a lot of systems thinking discourse happens in health, management, and engineering, but there is less emphasis in education. And one of the pioneers of system thinking, Peter Senge, explains it as like a discipline of seeing whole and understanding interrelationships, rather than focusing on isolated elements, like seeing patterns of change instead of focusing on fixed snapshots of things. And this is a way of understanding the world in a more interconnected and dynamic way rather than a set of isolated, fragmented parts. So in my dissertation, my definition of systems thinking is like in environmental education particularly, is influenced by Paulo Freire's concepts of eco-pedagogy. And I define systems thinking as like deepening, but as well as like widening our understanding, like broadening our understanding of environmental issues. Specifically, it includes recognizing like how local environmental issues are interconnected to broader global challenges like globalization, like development, economic growth, justice issues, and new methods of exploitation and oppression that we just mentioned before. So I'm trying to come up with a framework of systems thinking that simplifies as much as possible and makes it tangible the process of developing more systems thinking oriented environmental programs or activities, I would say.
Thank you for that. And I think a lot of what you just shared touches on the next question. So I just want to, and the next question really centered on, ways that sustainability might be presented in textbooks that we see in our classrooms, and what you're suggesting as a different way of looking or considering sustainability, right? So in my experience as a new teacher, when I would have to teach geography, for example, I would open up the textbook to the sustainability page, and you would see that trifecta, right? And we would say, we've achieved sustainability when the at the center of the Venn diagram. So we have a circle. I'll just describe it, I guess, for our listeners. We have our circle representing the economy, one for the environment, and one for the social dimension. And we would say to our students, we've achieved sustainability when at the point where those three circles all overlap. But what we're not doing is truly unpacking what each of those components actually means, and critically considering how one perhaps change or decision or action might not actually be supportive of the entire system of which we're all a part, and recognizing who's really a part of that system beyond the human dimension, or even within the human dimension, who specifically are we talking about. So I mean, this is something that kind of really challenged me in the workshop that you were leading, and I really appreciated it as someone who was a classroom teacher and who is now preparing teacher candidates to support this kind of thinking in their classrooms and all of these literacies that you're talking about. And so I guess I'm curious to know, right? I've been finding it as a teacher educator challenging to think about, how do we prepare teachers to enter the classroom confident in engaging this way with their students, and what is it we're asking them to do. So this also kind of leads into the next question with, what do you have an example of what that could look like in the classroom? But I'm also just really interested in what you might say also to teacher educators in this context as well.
I'm going to start with the ideas of sustainability you brought up. And I love the way that you frame it as approach to sustainability, because we have several approaches. And most of the approaches emphasize more on the economic pillar of sustainability compared to the social and the environmental one. And in the textbooks and in our conversations, when we first bring up the idea of sustainability, we define it and understand it from the World Commission of Environment and Development, like since 1987, which puts it in a way that it's the practice of meeting the current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. And if we read this definition from our today's realities, it indirectly means like limiting our consumption and giving up a lot of comfort and conveniences and luxuries for the sake of a future generation. And let's consider you're asking this question to a regular person. Like, what would you think their response would be to you about sustainability? Let me give up my luxuries now for the sake of people who are not yet here. So what would they say? You know, the first thing I can think of, and which is like most likely, is like, I don't care. Like, I'm not going to be here. I'm going to be dead. And it's not my problem. So this brings us to the whole idea of sustainability, instead of being just pillars and Venn diagrams, to be a mindset before becoming a lifestyle or anything else. So this mindset approach, like this old way of representing sustainability for the sake of like future generations, creates this lack of intimacy with sustainability related issues, and creates this gap in understanding of the importance of sustainability. First, we need to make sure that people think that sustainability is their problem before the problem of the next generation. And I view that creating this intimacy heavily depends on our ability to engage in systems thinking. Like, this involves recognizing that where do we stand, where do we fit in this complex system, understanding how we are contributing to sustainability or unsustainability, understanding how our own practices are coming back to us and harming us in so many different ways. So my approach of sustainability or systems thinking is trying to unpack these pillars and support students and teachers to make sense of these pillars as deeply intertwined systems, which include multiple sectors influencing and shaping one another. So I'm unpacking the pillars, integrating eco-pedagogical core goals, including those literacies. And it's a trying to come up with this framework. It's a work in progress. And it will always be a work in progress, because our systems will change and our understandings of systems will change. So we can't have a systems thinking framework and say that's it. You know, it's just the draft that we're coming up with. And this framework currently includes 8 dimensions. So I don't know at the end of my dissertation what will happen, how many dimensions I will end up having with. But they focus on like unpacking the social, environmental, and economic pillars into social, cultural, political, historical, economic, scientific, technology, energy, ethics, media, communication, all as dimensions of systems thinking. These dimensions of thought help us to question, like, who is involved in environmental issues? Like, who are the stakeholders? Why are they involved in the way they are if they are involved? And how are they influencing the problem? Who is benefiting? Who is paying the price, and how? Uh, in an example of this systems thinking, and how these dimensions can be integrated, I want to give the example of my first visit to Costco 4 years ago. Like, that was one of the biggest cultural shocks I've ever lived. Um, I told I'm going to just a supermarket, and I see everything in big sizes and wholesale amounts, um, selling in a very cheap prices. So um, that is already an emphasis on the cultural and the social dimension of systems thinking, because it shows how our ways of living and cultures shape the way we consume. The idea of the pantry that needs to be always full with all types of snacks for all family members is already a cultural aspect of food consumption, you know. And if we frame all this in waste management or recycling, which is one of the most common topics of environmental education, um, we can move this direction, the discussion from this cultural attention to eventually waste, and how much of organic and inorganic waste we are creating because of this wholesale consumption uh, idea. Waste that is also coming from the packaging. And all these interrelated, we can drive the conversation to packaging policies. When we focus on the quality of foods served in these or available in these markets, what's the amount of preservatives? What's the amount of added sugars, saturated fat? Like, it's not okay for your food not to get rotten in a few weeks, you know? So this leads to other preservation and food quality and monitoring policies that are essential in systems thinking. It also extends the discussion to what energy, how much of energy did we use to produce these products? How much of energy we use to transport these products? Because transportation is usually ignored, and which is a big carbon emission issue. So we bring the economic, technology and energy dimensions of systems thinking. So just an example of Costco visit, you may cover a lot of dimensions of systems thinking. We just need to expand these ideas and make the possible connections. So the connection between eco-pedagogy and systems thinking here in this example is powerful, because eco-pedagogy asks us to rethink the dominant narratives about sustainability, development, human nature relationships, which is overwhelming for educators, while systems thinking provides the tool to understand these complexities by targeting all these dimensions that we just talked about. And this reduces the nature of environmental education to be like fragmented and just getting like snapshots, and people thinking that if I recycle, I am being part of saving the world. Yes, you are doing a great job. Your contribution is very important, but at some point, we need to be realistic that there are so many other complex issues that need to be targeted to solve the problems.
Thank you. I really appreciate what I'm taking from this conversation a little bit as an educator who is not of a science background, but I think we would all agree that eco-pedagogy and sustainability are concepts that should be integrated across curricula and certainly are not reserved for science teachers. And what I'm taking from this is an exciting possibility to make learning relevant for students. For example, instead of opening the textbook to page 74 and everyone takes a turn reading, perhaps we can take a case study, a real life example like Costco, and imagine how deeply that could be unpacked with a class at a variety of ages in a variety of subjects. And this could be, a year-long inquiry into the different aspects, especially potentially using the framework that you are currently developing. And I'm sure I look forward to reading that at some point, when you're finished. Do you have, Shahi, do you have ideas or thoughts about some of the potential challenges that teachers may face as they begin to attempt to incorporate systems thinking and eco-pedagogy into their own teaching practice, and suggestions for how some of these challenges might be viewed or overcome?
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. When I first talk about eco-pedagogy and systems thinking to educators, they would say like, "Oh, I teach elementary students. I don't think they understand these things," which is something that brings us to the first challenge, which is age appropriation of systems thinking dimensions. Um, my argument here is that we don't expect all dimensions of systems thinking to be present in all lessons and at any age. We just need, the challenge here is to develop a horizontal and or vertical progression of systems thinking skills aligned with the student's developmental level. Um, Not all dimensions should be addressed at all grade levels. There is just extra effort that we need to make to adapt it to the group. That's one challenge. Another challenge, it's not a challenge, but something to consider, is the context appropriation. And when I say like systems thinking framework or eco-pedagogy, it's highly context dependent. Systems in each context are different. Situation is different. So systems thinking and eco-pedagogy can never be in a cookbook form. So it requires the teachers and educators, as you mentioned, Lauren, like in an interdisciplinary approach to develop and emphasize how the dimensions of systems thinking apply in that context. This requires partnerships in general. Partnerships, whether we are at the level of the school, among the departments of different subject areas, but it needs the input of the history teacher, the librarian, the technology teacher, whoever is involved in it. I want to come back to the challenge of the essence and the blind spot, because that's another challenge to keep this fire and the passion of really empowering students to stay there throughout the career in general and not just a few years. And one last thing I want to mention is that sustainability and environmental issues can never be apolitical. So we feel like we can feel that now more than ever. And another challenge of eco-pedagogy and systems thinking would be would ask educators to navigate this complex, sometimes politically sensitive topics, which can feel overwhelming, and especially when we face a pushback from institutions or parents. But it is less likely for parents to push back on an idea that contributes to the well-being and health of their families. If we think about it from that standpoint, that how understanding contaminants, toxins, and relating it to our well-being, this will reduce the possibility of pushbacks, at least from parents. we are selfish creatures, like our well-being and the well-being of our family comes before everything. And the challenge is just like how to frame what discussions, how to frame the discussions in a way that opponents would be also interested in it. Like that's a key challenge. That how to invite people to care and feel the intimacy and the importance of the environmental and sustainability issues we are addressing in class.
Well, I do. I hate to take up. So I just have so many thought. I really just appreciate this conversation. I love it. I know one challenge that I have heard and even experienced in my own life is not always so much the idea that of only selfishness, but just helplessness. I know speaking to some students and parents and friends, a challenge might be, well, I do want to contribute and I do want to leave a better world for my children, even if it means personal sacrifice, but I truly don't believe that anything I do matters. I just really believe I am less than a drop in the ocean, and therefore I throw up my hands. And I just wonder if you have a philosophical or practical response to that feeling of helplessness amongst those members of the population who may have good intentions, but just feel helpless.
I know this is a challenge. Sometimes I feel helpless in the whole story. It's not like everything is la la land and pinky world on my end, but it's just about the effort and the trial to keep the hope going. My answer to that would be that helplessness is the concept of, or the feeling of helplessness is promoted when we don't realize our agency. And where are we in these systems that we are talking about that we can influence? At the end, we are the consumers. Like, we run the economy. And by reflecting on our roles and taking collective action as critical consumers, we can influence the entire demand and supply chain of corporations. When students and educators grasp their power to shape these chains, to produce more sustainably through conscious consumption and make informed decisions, by, for example, resisting the traps set by media and marketing campaigns and opposing the pervasive cultures of overconsumption. Here is the idea of sustainable lifestyle. Here is where the idea of sustainable lifestyle truly roots. The process embodies the essence of eco-pedagogy and critical pedagogy through the lens of systems thinking. We just need to understand where is our power, where is our agency, and what are the leverage points of the systems that we can work on and invest our agency and power in. Once we understand that through systems thinking, that is when it is less likely to become helpless. It's not guaranteed, but it is less likely at least.
Love that. And I really like what you said about helplessness being the result of not having or not being aware of our agency. Because one of my questions was going to be about what do we do once we've helped folks to understand where they are in the system, and that's that agency piece. That's what I'm hearing. So I really like that. And I also really like that you mentioned that eco-pedagogy and systems thinking cannot be apolitical. A conversation that comes up time and again when I'm working with pre-service teachers, when I'm reminding them that their job is political, there's this fear. I think there's this misunderstanding about what it means to allow politics into the classroom. And a common misunderstanding or that I hear is that it means to impose your political views onto your students. But and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing from you is that in unpacking the system, so if we're using the Costco example and asking just a critical question, and in looking for that information, students are automatically becoming aware of the political dimension on their own of these systems or these decisions that we're making every day. And so it really isn't us imposing our views on our students, but allowing them to uncover that information and form their own opinions.
From Paulo Freire's eco-pedagogy perspectives on the whole concept of eco-pedagogy is that you're not imposing any idea on the students. It's just even the teachers and educators are learning through the process. It's about co-constructing knowledge. It's just like opening up the space, that democratic space for students to reflect on their realities, on the realities they are living in. That's why the implementation of eco-pedagogy and systems thinking should start by like the most small exam, everyday life examples, where you are asking students to think about their realities. Because from eco-pedagogical perspective, you will not be able to take action, which is the idea of the praxis in critical pedagogy. You will not reach to that level of action before reflecting on your realities. So the role of the educator here is just creating the space and providing the context for students to think and co-construct with you the critical thinking about whatever topic you are discussing. Like as environmental educators, we do great job in place-based learning, which we argue that that's the core of where engagement and action starts, But even from the pioneer of place-based learning, Sobel, place-based learning is the process of using local community and environment as a starting point. So it's just a starting point. If we implement place-based education, but we stop there, the concepts of environmental issues will stay fragmented and incomplete. So the idea is how we invest on the already amazing place-based efforts to extend our understanding beyond the place into abstract social systems that are mainly controlling the spaces and the places and the society we have. I don't know if this makes sense.
It's great.
I'm writing down direct quotes as you speak that I'm going to refer to in the future for inspiration.
I keep coming back to this question in it. So, I mean, Lauren, we've talked about this before in our work with teacher candidates who want, and teachers, right? They want something that they can just almost the recipe book that you mentioned, right? And I know I'm with you. This isn't a recipe book scenario. This isn't something that can be done that way because contexts are so different. So do you have any words for teachers or educators who, like Lauren said earlier, they really want to do this. They understand that it's important. This is maybe and there's a bit of a maybe part B here. They understand this is important. They want to get started. They're not sure how, but also they feel like, this is something I hear a lot, they're not content experts. They feel like they have to be an expert in the content before they embark with their students, right? Like, I need to know all about Costco and all about the brands and all about the carbon footprint of each of these brands. And that's overwhelming to me. So I do not feel confident pitching that to my class.
Tell me about it. Tell me about it. Because when I
like it's unending.
Exactly, because when I started like researching and writing about systems thinking, I would say like, shoot, I have no idea what do these dimensions really include or how deep I should know about these dimensions, you know? But I will share my experience because I was in the same positionality of getting overwhelmed of I need to know everything. But one of the most helpful things for me is simply reading the news, simply reading environmental news, because that's a great start for critical thinking and systems thinking, or starting to map the stakeholders. Like, who is involved in the conversation? And it's not the cookbook, but it's an idea that I highly depend on, which is simply the concept mapping and stakeholder mapping. In my courses at NYU, I asked my students throughout the semester to start developing maps, and they continue working on those maps until the end of the semester. Every time they encounter a new stakeholder, they add to the map and um, bring the conversation or the perspective of that sector or stakeholder to class. One of the activities that I highly enjoy and I highly recommend, which is another way of making use of our students' addiction and joy of screens, is like I recommend them some movies and documentaries for them to watch. For example, for my water and sustainability course, I assign Dark Waters movie. And in that, while they're watching the movie, every new stakeholder shows up. They need to create a map and develop the concept map. And they are fascinated how lawyers, how animals, how politicians and uh, municipalities show up in the movie. And just 2 hours of that activity is enough to already introduce a lot of stakeholders and initiate the discussion on a lot of systems thinking dimensions.
I think this connects a little bit to leverage points. I just want to highlight that as a concept, which you mentioned a few minutes ago. And I've written here that through systems thinking, we can potentially identify where the leverage points are in our realities and in our contexts where we can invest our energy in order to actually create change. I just want to highlight that a little bit because I have found the leverage point to be a useful concept for me. And I was wondering if you could just provide, to help for our listeners conceptualize this idea, an example of what a leverage point might be in a particular context, understanding that it's different in every context. But could you give us an example of one of those leverage points where we could invest our energy to make a change, or where one could?
Mm-hmm. So the idea of leverage points, I take it from another pioneer in system thinking, Daniel Meadow. And it is the main idea that the question is always like, where do we start change? Yes, we want change, but where do we start change? Do we start from individuals, but that needs to scale up? Do we start with families? Do we start with policy changes, which might be like top-down approaches, but sometimes top-down approaches may help, maybe beneficial. In leverage points, it's kind of identifying what do we access to, like what can we really influence in this current reality. Those might be only community members, and that's fine. Just creating a momentum, creating a movement. That's it. That might be a leverage point. Extending this to attending hearings, getting involved in evaluating acts before they pass. That's another leverage point. Um, it doesn't need to be only through radical protests, which are important and appreciated. They have their role, but more strategically using the social networks to start influencing decision makers. But before that, we need to kind of map the decision makers in the context that we live in to see who has connection to whom and how.
Amazing. I'm writing that down. Sorry. So in your example of when you ask students to map out stakeholders, the map that they're constructing throughout a term, so not just the one on in response to the documentary. Is this one map, and are we talking about stakeholders on like in one issue, or are we talking about just different stakeholders and their interests so that we can, I mean, I'll leave it there. Are we talking just about different stakeholders that come up and their interests?
Um, so my students mainly work in groups, and every group comes up with a different concept map of stakeholders. So there is no one way of looking at it. And at the end of the course, as a wrap up, we merge and see who's missing in general. But there is no one way of doing it. Usually, we rely on writing storyboards. Uh, that that is very interesting and essential for the historical perspectives. For example, in water and sustainability course, when they write the story of water in New York City, the story basically starts from indigenous people who were there. The whole structure of Manhattan was different. There were rivers and canals that don't exist now. The history extends to how slaves were used as labor to build the system of like the water pipes and the water systems. Um, so each activity may be focusing on one dimension more than the other, but at the end, when you merge all these stakeholders from different examples, from different activities, it gives you a kind of an understanding or a starting point when we take any issue of related to the environment, what to consider. Maybe not all stakeholders are involved in all issues, but at least you have in your capability and in your understanding that I need to be searching for these stakeholders and this issue. How are lawyers involved? How are insurance companies involved in this issue? Because they get these ideas from different activities, you know?
If we were thinking about, so my research is in climate change education, and I think, so I'm thinking about this in the context of the climate crisis. And I think a lot about given our current political climate and the polarization that's happening around us, I'm thinking about different stakeholders on this issue, and I think that that map would be very large. I would need many, many, many pieces of paper to do that one. But would like a next step after doing something like that be looking for common values between groups of stakeholders as a way forward? Because is that what we're maybe considering? So if we're looking for solutions to challenges, are we looking for parallels in between these different groups so that we can consider how we might all come together?
Mhm. My dissertation actually has in its extended part that I'm not talking about is is mainly how to use partnerships and networks uh, for promoting systems thinking at the community level. So the challenge of systems thinking is that no one sector can achieve it. It's impossible. That's why in whatever scale you are, whether the school, the state, or nation, there needs to be partnerships. And the essence of partnership is not just collaboration. Sometimes we call collaborations partnerships. Collaborations are on a more shallow level. But when it comes to partnerships, the process of partnering may take years because the process of partnering requires what you are addressing to come to a point where we have a shared vision of the problems and shared values of addressing the problems. Even if the partners have different institutional logics, even if they have different foci. But when it comes to the partnership, we need all voices. And at some point, we need to face the hard difficulty, like the difficult experience of talking to private corporations. Um, Not to oppose them in the first place, because we think that we need to oppose them. But first, again, back to the conversation of how do we shape our discussions in a way that the person who is opposing me will be interested in what I am talking about. And there are a lot of banks and private corporations now they have sustainability departments, ESGs and stuff, like these departments, and they have tons of money. They just need to get rid of it just to fill out reports and numbers that they are doing something about sustainability. So how we can, that's a leverage point, for example, like to go and say, like, you have the money, I have the labor force and the idea, sponsor it, let me do it. They will not work. The work will be done for them, but we have our mission. That's a partnership because there is a mutual understanding of what should be done, what is good to be done, and there are mutual benefits at the end. So there is no partnership without shared values and shared vision. But we need to learn how to sit and discuss these things with people who think differently, and they have different intentions.
Thank you. I mean, I'm not going to ask that second last question. I think we've talked about it. So I'm going to just ask you, Shaghig, is there anything else you would like to share with us today before we wrap up our episode?
What I want to share, I shared a lot already, but one thing I want to leave this podcast with is that I believe that the way we teach about environmental issues shapes not only what students know, but also how educators see their role in the world. And embracing the complexities and fostering critical thinking, we have the power to help the students imagine and communities in general to imagine and create new realities uh, with new ways of doing things, like the partnerships, which we started talking about it late, but that's the core of my dissertation. Um, and I just also want to encourage educators to see eco-pedagogy and systems thinking as a journey and not a destination or a method or a cookbook. It's not about knowing all the answers at once, but at least start questioning. What matters is fostering learning environment where students and teachers at the same time can critically explore and just co-construct knowledge. That's the true essence of critical thinking and the essence of eco-pedagogy.
Well, thank you for your very important and inspiring work and for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me here.
We would like to acknowledge that this episode was recorded on Michissagig, Mississauga territory, treaty and traditional, at Trent University in Peterborough, Nogojoanong, Ontario, Canada. We are grateful to the First Nations of this territory for their teachings about and care for the land on which we teach and learn. The podcast was made possible by a Trent University Knowledge Mobilization Grant and is skillfully edited and produced by our friend James Bailey.